Welcome to my world history notes, where I read from the book that I wrote to teach homeschoolers a kind of a survey of world history called A Bible Believer Looks at World History, which you can find on lulu.com, amazon.com, or at the Bible Baptist bookstore. Today, I'm going to talk about China, Korea, Japan, and the Americas briefly. At this time, I'm discussing here after Christ era of Christ's birth and life. So China had become fragmented in many different kingdoms, but the climatic disasters of the 6th century changed that scenario. The Nanxi, or the history of the southern dynasties, and Sui Shu, or the history of the Sui dynasty, records the severe dust storms that swept China. It was then hit by severe frost, and there was even snow in August, ruining crops in a province that was on the same parallel with Spain. Crop failure led to famine, even a series of famines. Excuse me. These disasters had two important political effects. One led to greater power assumed by central governments for the welfare of the people, and the other was weakening of their economies. This led to uprisings and rebellions, particularly among the Vietnamese near Hanoi. Buddhism had come to present a messiah figure named Maitreya, who would come to save the world that was completely steeped in evil, and this belief became dominant during the troubled times. Maitreya had made a comeback under the mantle of New Age belief today, and can be found extensively on the internet as having actually returned already, and even to have allegedly to have spoken to the United Nations. This quote, New Age Messiah, has an outspoken advocate and a phony, or had an outspoken advocate and a phony named Benjamin Cream, but the world will look to anything but Jesus Christ. The climatic upheaval, disease, and famine resulted in the unification of China, with the power center being in the north after the Sui under Emperor Wendi invaded the south with a force of 500,000 men and a navy. This disastrous century also unified the Korean peninsula under the Silla dynasty and its successor state, Koryo, from which we get the name Korea, which came to power after the downfall of the Silla in the 10th century. Japan, too, was hit by plagues and extreme climate change during the 6th century and had to deal with great Korean immigration. The epidemic that struck Japan was probably smallpox, and in many areas, as much as 60% of the population died. Buddhism became a dominant religious force in Japan when the native gods seemed helpless to stop the pestilence, or perhaps, as some believe, were angry with the Japanese for unfaithfulness. Chinese culture brought from Korea had a tremendous impact on Japan, and the final triumph of Buddhism at that time added to the disasters of disease and plague and helped to form the Japanese into a coherent nation. In America's early 6th century, Teotihuacan was at its peak, a powerful city, a metropolis, the heart of religio military empire that held sway over what is now southern part of Mexico, much of Guatemala, and Belize. It was an empire that consisted of many different tribes and kingdoms, some of whom had been conquered and some of which were long-term allies, and some who were paying tribute. Religion and trade bound it together. The largest city in the Americas has between 100 and 200,000 people. It was the sixth largest city in the world. Several million Mayans and Mexicans depended on the trade it oversaw for their survival. Um, the city was the center of mass manufactured goods such as obsidian spearheads, from Teotihuacan now, and blowpipe darts to knife blades and beautifully made statues of human beings and animals. A flourishing industry, as in Rome, for idol worship. Many other workshops have been found that specialized in making baskets, mats, potteries, textiles, as well as jewelry made out of seashells and statues cut from basalt. Archaeological evidence in the suburbs reveals a large merchant community of foreigners with an import-export business that must have been on a truly massive scale. The majority, though, of the inhabitants would have been farm workers. The society existed on agriculture as most societies did at that time. The priest kings who ruled over this empire derived their authority from the gods, particularly the rain god, Tlaloc, and credited themselves for the blessings of rain. In the late 1960s, an American tree ring specialist, Valmore Lamarche of the University of Arizona, collected a substantial number of high-altitude bristle cones from Campeto Mountain in California, suggesting climatic deterioration beginning around 535 AD. Growth did not return to normal until the late 550s. In early Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, about 500 miles east of Teotihuacan, there is archaeological evidence of a 25 to 50-year-long drought that started in the middle of the 6th century, from the 500s. Similar evidence in Chile and Argentina show that the winter of 540 would have been the coldest winter in 1,600 years. A 1983 Ohio State University study of Peru's 18,711-foot high Quelccaya Glacier revealed to OSU's, quote, Institute of Polar Studies, that there must have been a horrific drought around the middle of the 6th century, lasting upwards of 30 years. Colombian archaeologists Clemencia Plazas and Ana Falchetti, studying the San Jorge Basin in Colombia, published that the mid-6th century was the driest period in history, and this was confirmed by studies in the lower Amazon basin in Brazil and in lakes in the Colombian Andes. These studies were all done separately at different times and by different scientists from different universities in different countries, but all came to a similar conclusion that might serve to explain to us what happened to the great city of Teotihuacan, if they are correct in their assumptions and conclusions. Evidence at Teotihuacan itself reveals burned temples, death from malnutrition, deserted houses, smashed idols, murdered members of the city's elite, who as a practice would have taken responsibility for the good weather that allowed their civilization to continue and therefore would probably have been held responsible, excuse me, for the drought. University of Houston anthropologist Rebecca Story has studied over 150 skeletons in a cemetery on the south side of the city and has published that even before the collapse of the city, people have started dying younger. By the time the city was abandoned, 70% were dying before the age of 25. The previously mentioned book, Chronicle of the Maya Kings and Queens, tells us how the Mayan city of Tikal also slipped into a dark age about the middle of the 6th century, with idols smashed or unfinished, and the king at that time, Wakchun Khalil, or Double Bird, disappearing. For the next 130 years, not a single dated monument or even a fragment of one is identified at Tikal. The Maya finally collapsed completely as a civilization of note by the mid-700s. They still exist today as the most poor and desperate natives of Central America, but once were a mighty civilization. When you see news stories about their tragic fates in hurricanes and other natural disasters, just remember that once they ruled over great cities in the jungles of Mexico with kingly names like Animal Skull and Spear-Throwing Owl. Teotihuacan, boasting a population of 5 to 8 times as many people as the largest Mexican city and overseeing a territory dozens of times larger than any Mayan city, was, however, the focal point of Mesoamerican civilization, and its downfall heralded a vast change in their centers of power and the dominance of peoples in the region. In North America, the Anasazi of New Mexico and Arizona, where Pueblo Indians still live in Pueblo towns, has left us evidence of a highly advanced civilization after 1000. However, at the time period we're discussing, they were hunters and gatherers, did not even live in villages, archaeologists tell us. In the mid-6th century, all of this changed. Suddenly, they became 80% agricultural, improving their hunting technology by adopting the bow and arrow over the spear, using sophisticated stone axes for farming, and the inevitable pottery became more widespread. This, quote, sudden transformation has confused archaeologists and historians alike, but clues abound, and many of these scientists think that the climatic events occurring around the time of the middle 6th century helped push the hunting and gathering Anasazi into contact with another Indian or Native American, if you want to be politically correct, culture from hundreds of miles to the east called the late Woodland culture, although I doubt that is what they called themselves. Ceramic pottery gives the clues as to their contact via trade. What all of this pottery evidence suggests to archaeologists is that this was a time of great population movement and interaction, which is often the result of stresses on the environment that sustains a people, things such as drought. While other cultures around the world were dying or convulsing in horror, there were some that were just starting the uphill climb from savagery to civilization. Of course, there isn't much difference between the two except for some fancy buildings. We're going to talk about Pope Gregory next, very important person in history, in European history, and I thank you for watching and listening.